I say this a lot. A lot of people refer to democracy as this grand experiment, as this great experiment. No, it wasn't an experiment. So what happened is it, resurged in the 17th, 18th century, right in the U.S. The model taken, of course, from ancient Athens and ancient Greece, and then just almost arbitrarily in an ad hoc way decided this is what's going to work, this is what we're going to choose, it will give us more freedom. But the only data that these folks had was previous iterations of democracy in the past. In a real experiment, you have data ingestion, right? Quantitative and qualitative. You have a complete map of what works and what doesn't based on some metric that you've optimized around, right? So none of that, of course, existed, but during the time we didn't have the scientific acumen that we now have. So this is a huge thing. Democracy was not an experiment, but now we can run actual experiments in governance, right?
Welcome to the next How to DAO podcast. Today, we will talk maybe a little bit about DAOs, but we will also talk about concept which is a little broader than DAOs itself, and it's network states. And we have Sterling here, who is working with network states, in the space for a while. So Sterling, welcome on the podcast. Maybe let's start with some basic definition how you see network states and what they are.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, Puncar. Really happy to be here and make your acquaintance, my friend. Yeah, so network state it was first defined by Balaji in his book, Balaji Srinivasan in his book, The Network State. And first we'll start with how he defines it. So he defines it as a community that meets in the cloud in some type of communication, chat app, or a blockchain community. And at some point, they beam that community down to the land, maybe in a special economic zone, maybe not, and they build their community out from the ground. And typically, one of the defining characteristics or features of these network states is that they're driven by what Balaji calls a one commandment, right? Or a guiding principle. And then they share values. Maybe they even have a national identity. That's Balaji's definition. Now, the term that I like to use is cyber state, or one that is synonymous is autonomous political formation.
Okay.
Right. And so the idea there is that you don't even necessarily need physical land. You build a governance structure and a community in the cloud, and you engage in different types of decentralized financial activities. You have a community. You might even vote on different activities within that community. And in my definition, I'm not against people going to the land and developing a community. It's actually, that's great if they can do it, but you don't have to. Where the original impetus for this idea stems from the cypherpunk ethos. So Timothy May in 1992 wrote an article called Libertarian Cyberspace. And in that article, he defines this notion of a evolutionary self-selecting community in the cloud that leverages strong encryption guarantees to protect themselves from totalitarian states and nefarious actors. So this is the original vision of a network state, and that's what I define as a cyber state. People like Peter Ludlow also defined it as a cyber state. So that's the difference. And I'll maybe just hone in on this a little bit more. So Balaji believes that these communities ultimately need to seek a diplomatic recognition from the United Nations. And I find this a humorous proposition because it's like you're trying to play in the old boys club, right? You're trying to get permission from your masters to create and build and generate communities. And that, I think it's naive at best, because one is you have to get big enough to do that. And then they have to like you and not see you as a threat. But I think what makes it worse is that you just end up getting back into the same geopolitical dynamics that have been destructive and corruption prone since day one. So instead, why don't we just build anti-fragile tech, create communities, and not appeal to the system as it stands for sovereignty? Right? So that's...
So basically, if I understand it correctly, Balaji is more like network state. It's like there will be some land involved as well, like a physical community, and also he kind of wants to connect that to the traditional world, because he's asking UN for some recognition, which is basically just getting into the same game of creating new nation states in general terms. And there are actually a couple which I think are trying to do similar things, like Liberland, which is between Croatia and Serbia. They're kind of claiming a land and they are asking other states for recognition. There's probably some examples of where maybe the Balaji vision is kind of executing a little bit. But I like that you are coming from way before Balaji kind of thing, the cyberspace. like the land, it's not the only space we live in. Like now, I don't know the statistics, but like I feel like at least 50% of our time we spend in digital space, you know, on our phones, on our computers. Our financial assets are mostly digital. Like I don't carry any cash. Yeah, basically all my, you know, net worth, I may be different. My net worth is a crypto, but like even if it's in the bank, it's kind of digital at this very moment. Just to like build on top of it, it's like, okay, now when we have this new space, the digital space, like how we protect ourselves from the original nation state is kind of the philosophy you like. Is that correct?
I mean, it's an idea. The idea is trying to become, you know, thinking about that book, The Sovereign Individual. It was very, very prophetic in its views. The idea is that individuals will be able to basically exit into the cloud, right, into cyberspace, and then they'll be able to interact with communities that care, communities that share values, and they are also insulated from bad actors, black hat hackers, nefarious entities, and potentially rogue states, right, that want to come after them. So that's my view, is it's a community that is deeply connected and that forms its own sort of self-perpetuating cultural apparatus, right, if I were to describe it. And then, yeah, maybe they do come down to the land at some point and build out. The problem with doing that is that you usually have to appeal to some type of state actor. You may get some special privileges, which I think's fine, right? If you use a special economic zone to build that community out, that's great. I wanted to comment too on the Liberland thing you mentioned, and I have met Vit Jedlicka, who's like the head of Liberland before, and I've talked a little bit about it. But I think, so if we're being really onerous about the use of terminology, I would say that that's probably not a network state in the sense that, or a cyber state in the sense that it's not a community that was necessarily on the cloud first. Might be a bit ambiguous, but some people probably were. But his idea was to just claim the land first, right? And then bring the people there, hence the passport situation and setup. So there is a little bit, and I don't want to be a stickler for definitions. I mean, there's so many people circle jerking different kinds of terms in the space that it becomes like a grueling exercise in mental self-destruction. So and frankly, what's happening, we're moving so fast at such a rapid pace in the cyberstate ecosystem that it's extremely challenging to keep up with all the different terms, because different communities are manufacturing their own terms and they have all nuances and definitions. And so trying to pin something down, it's almost like trying to go into like a subatomic level and pin down a fucking quark. You're going to have a lot of trouble doing that. And scientists actually do have trouble doing that. So anyway, that's a terminology issue that we have.
Like we do have the same in the DAOs, because like, you know, DAOs are like, there was maybe one DAO, the original DAO, and then like so many other DAOs happens, and like everyone is kind of, we are like more DAO than the other DAO because this and because that. And like then we are tweaking the terms, or like before that there was like a DAC, like the Decentralized Autonomous Corporation. It was like really the difference. And like, maybe that's not the point where we should be arguing. You know, we should be just like innovating, trying different stuff. And then later on, we can define it and standardize it. But as of now, I feel like we are in this like explosion of innovation, and we just like, everyone is trying what will work and what doesn't. And I feel like the cyberspace and the network states are in the same kind of, you know, ballpark. Like, let's innovate. We will agree on the terms later. Do you agree kind of?
Yeah, no, I agree completely, because what's happening is, you know, especially in just the last couple of decades and going back to, like a century, Ray Kurzweil wrote about this idea of the singularity being near, where technology has started to advance at such a rapid pace that it's impossible to keep track of everything happening, right? And there's a bunch of different spheres of this, right? Obviously, artificial intelligence, fields like synthetic biology, various applications of biotech, but everything, and then of course governance and network states, cyber states, and the blockchain tech that underlies it is all advancing so rapidly that it's really difficult for us to pin down the precision terminology that we want to use to describe all the manifestations of it. And I think that's just a consequence of this notion of getting ever more accelerating progress in our activities. But what this also belies is a collective bewilderment about where we're actually going. And so how do we like catalog and characterize and understand that, right? And I think this is why a lot of people have started talking more about risk management. This is kind of another topic we could get into, like existential risk management, dealing with
like risk management for the whole humanity, basically.
Yeah, for all of humanity. humanity. And like one of the areas where I focus on and think about a lot is in governance and cyber states. Like how do we grow these communities in a way that doesn't create second and third order effects, like externalities, downstream consequences? Because that's one of the biggest problems in our current system is that we have these very heavily centralized top-down industries and governments that ultimately corrupt. And so it's very difficult for them to solve any kind of problem without creating other problems, simply because everyone's, it's a Molochian dynamic. They're optimizing for their own good at the expense of collective well-being. So I think one of the things that we can really achieve with the network state, cyber state movement is being able to move forward in a way that creates more sustainable outcomes for our species. It creates ways for us to live and cooperate without as much corruption, right? Because we're more focused on decentralization, principles of being censorship resistant, but also having things like transparency for higher end groups or wherever power has a tendency to accumulate, right? Because it always goes somewhere, right? So yeah, I know that's maybe a whole other topic.
But maybe that's a good topic to continue with.
Sure.
Because what you are saying, we want to avoid the inefficiencies and the briberies and the power structures created. But when I look at the DAO space, larger the DAO is, more politics are happening and more backdoor conversations are happening. And they are decentralized, they are voted by token holders. But at the end of the day, you realize there is a couple people pulling the strings or a couple groups which are more involved than the others. So I feel like it's basically as it grows too big, it's getting into the same problems that nation states are kind of having, where the power structures are created and then, the inefficiencies are there as well. So how you are actually avoiding it? I know you work a lot on governance, so what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a really tough one because here's the thing first, and this is actually described in a book that I gave to you. Actually, Jared and Peter wrote Farewell to Westphalia, No Problem, and they discuss this problem at length, and they make a lot of really good points. And one of those points is here's the thing, nothing can ever be 100% decentralized. Nothing can be ever 100% trustless. This idea of trustlessness, for lack of a better phrase, emanates our whole ecosystem. It has mimetic propulsion in its own right now. But the thing is that everything ultimately bottoms out with human beings, right? Because we still live in communities. We have a physical presence. We can leverage these technologies to augment our relationships and to help incentivize better actions. But at the end of the day, we really have to get the incentives correct in these systems so that we can create a less corruption prone and less inefficiency prone human community. But here's the thing. I don't believe that it's ever going to, this is key. It's never going to be perfect. But here's the thing I think about a lot. Now we actually have the opportunity to experiment with novel governance models, with novel human organization frameworks, right? I say this a lot. A lot of people refer to democracy as this grand experiment, as this great experiment. No, it wasn't an experiment. So what happened is it, resurged in the 17th, 18th century, right in the US. The model taken, of course, from ancient Athens and ancient Greece. And then just almost arbitrarily in an ad hoc way decided this is what's going to work. This is what we're going to choose. It will give us more freedom. But the only data that these folks had was previous iterations of democracy in the past. In a real experiment, you have data ingestion, right? Quantitative and qualitative. You have a complete map of what works and what doesn't based on some metric that you've optimized around, right? So none of that, of course, existed, but during the time we didn't have the scientific acumen that we now have. So this is a huge thing. Democracy was not an experiment, but now we can run actual experiments in governance, right? In ways that we haven't been able to before, and we can optimize around different kinds of conditions, but with all these petri dishes, and we can prevent the inevitable violence that typically is associated with closed human systems, right? Because now we can allow for people to exit communities they don't agree with, right? So there's this principle of keeping exit and switching costs very low in cyber state environments. And so now we can actually try to understand what are the best human arrangements economically, socially, spiritually, physically that lead to more collective well-being, to more individual flourishing, more collective flourishing. And so I think we're in a beautiful time. There's been no other time in the history of our species where we can augment our governance operations and our collective sense making. And so this is a perfect time, and we have to act now, though. right? And just a side point to this, we're dealing with what a philosopher Daniel Schmachtenberger called the meta crisis, right?
Okay.
This idea that we're facing a multitude of different kinds of crisis points. We kind of touched on it with AI. You have things like climatological change. You have oceans filled with microplastics. You have these massive behemoth monocultural governments that, like the U.S. and China, that are kind of taking over all the economic action and controlling their populations. So to salvage our species, right, because we do certainly risk extinction if we make a wrong decision, we have to be able to experiment with our governance models, and we have to keep our societies miniaturized, right, because it's in these smaller environments that we can really focus down singular problems and address those problems in rigorous ways, right? And this goes back to the point of when you have a large mass behemoth that is just like focused around a centralized power vacuum, then solving these problems is impossible, right? Really, and I mean that very literally. It's impossible because everyone's optimizing for the wrong shit, right? They're optimizing for their own power. And there's no, like, the guardrails are really poorly constructed, whereas we can construct those in a more adequate and efficient way when we have more control over a decentralized sort of environment, in the sense that a good example, actually a real life example right now is, let's just take Prospera, right? Not perfect. And I'm not making that claim. I don't want anyone to think that. But they are very much focused on one singular problem, right? Longevity, human longevity, and biotech development, right? So they're doing that. Now imagine you have another community another network state or a pop-up that emerges, like from the cloud, right, down to the ground. And these folks get together. Now they focus on oceanic microplastics, right? Now maybe they're able to leverage their knowledge and acumen to understand the sensory apparatus that's in the ocean, right? And then they can start addressing those problems in a way that prevents, like, second and third order effects, because they've got their governance structured in such a way that prevents the emergence of those, like, negative game theoretic dynamics, things like Hobbesian traps, etc., where everyone's trying to preempt everyone and they're not focused on the problem. So that's the sweep of the argument. I think we have an opportunity now, and we have to take advantage of it if we're going to salvage ourselves, because there's no guarantee that our species survives in perpetuity. And anyone who tells you any different is either lying or they're completely asleep to the predicament that we find ourselves in.
Well, yeah, no, I think one point I want to just, like, clarify for our listeners is, like, the right to exit, which I think it's very important within the network state kind of and cyber state community. Like, in the nation states, you still can kind of give up your passport. Like, it's possible, but the cost is super high.
Yeah, right.
If you don't have another passport, basically, you can stick to, then you are getting into, like, weird legislation about, like, non-state citizen, and, like, you probably don't want to go that road. But in the cyberspace, like, if you just exit, like, you are not basically impacted, and, like, you just don't agree with the community, you join different community, and it's very easy to kind of go around, which I think is super cool. And, you know, it's kind of like when you are part of a DAO or company, like, it's also very easier to exit it and enter some new one. But in the nation state, that kind of concept was not really possible. I think that's important for our listeners to just understand there. On that, like, risk, basically, of extinction, it's a tough topic.
Heavy.
It's heavy. I feel like it started with, like, the nuclear bomb, because like, before that, like, you couldn't really, like, destroy the whole world overnight, but since then you can. Russia, US, China, and whoever else has the nuclear bombs, like, decide to just press the button, like, we are all kind of extinct in a sense. And now there is more risks actually popping up. Like, you mentioned the AI, you mentioned the biotech. To play a little of devil advocate here, like, you mentioned, like, Prospera on the biotech, or the community on, like, you know, microplastic in the ocean. Like, the nation states have rules in place because that's kind of like a risk management. So, like, they don't, like, if you want to, like, work on some, like, diseases, there is probably a lot of safety measures you need to, like, comply with, so it doesn't just get outside, you know, and we have another pandemic which can be worse than the previous one. But these communities, they're like special zones, they kind of don't have that. Like, do you see actually, like, what's the risk reward perspective from your perspective there? Like, you know, they can actually build something which will be actually getting the population extinct, even with the microplastic. They can just make it worse, and then all the fish will die, and then, it goes from there.
Yeah, no, that's a really fantastic point. So yeah, there's a bit of a balancing act there. I think one of the first things to consider with the nation state is that we realize that the bureaucracy is so entrenched in a lot of ways, and this is particular of the US, that it's very difficult to do any kind of technological development, especially in sensitive fields, without getting completely stopped and blockaded by red tape. So that's one of the reasons that folks have decided to, like even in Prospera, to incorporate there and to work on biotech problems. But you're right. So now what happens where it feels like they have more free reign, now maybe they just go crazy with, bioweaponry or whatever, and it just grows out of control. This is just my personal opinion. We can get into the variations of this, but I'm a huge fan of the notion of self-regulation, right? And I think this idea is already deeply embedded in a lot of our communities. I mean, what is DAC but a method of self-regulation? Like this notion of defensive or differential acceleration means that we try to move forward, but we understand that there are risks that we have to manage. And I think what we need are not like a ton of government bureaucracies to come in and just stifle this because they're afraid of something negative might be happening. What's ironic, of course, though, is governments are the ones that have traditionally ran the risk of creating massive, widespread, strife, struggling, death, decay, and that can be problematic. But I think if we have the proper institutions in place and we have a guiding cultural values and influence on the different network states, that we can properly self-regulate and we can apportion different kinds of understanding on how tech development and how what's the word I'm looking for? How a cultural understanding of the tech can manifest in those communities in ways that are safer. That's what I'm trying to say. In ways that are safer, in ways that can move forward without causing harm. But you need institutions in place to help with this. This is one of the things that Polis Labs that we kind of try to work on, is being more of an influential arbiter by trying to provide frameworks and understanding for how humans can organize and also understand existential risk, right? But it's not, we're not the only one. There are a lot of people actually working on this. There's an organization called Radical Exchange. I think the guy was here from it. They work on governance, MetaGov also. So you have organizations that are working on different aspects of this, trying to figure out how we can build these technologies and tools out while maintaining the balance, where you don't have these overarching, regulations by governments that have caused more harm than good, right? So, your thoughts?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I feel like as the market maturing and like more experiments are happening and more research, like we are getting better in like safeguarding those experiments. Like, at the beginning, it's maybe 1-2 people just like trying stuff out, and it's maybe very, very risky because like, if you are working on your own on something, like only your own conscious is the risk management, but sometimes you just underestimate some aspects. But when you have more people involved and it's like, cross-check with other perspective and the thing is more mature, I believe like then like you actually like eliminating the risk there. Where I wanted to go from here is you are working on this governance experiments with Polis Labs. Like what you generally found like it's working at this early cyberspaces. And the second question which I wanted to ask is, do you think nation states can actually learn from it? So do you think like, because that's what I heard from another person who is like kind of working on network states and lifelong Bitcoiner, that like we are doing this so we can actually improve our nation states. So basically like he's also like from United States, and you mentioned like there is a lot of bureaucracy. Can actually United States maybe learn from one of the experiment nations and implement them itself? So then we kind of, as a citizens or residents of United States, would be just better off.
Yeah, that's extremely feasible. I'll go back to the original thing about how, some of the issues that we're already seeing is we do like qualitative research and we do focus groups and we try to understand what the dynamics are of the humans involved in these communities. And one of the very base things that hasn't even been fully resolved that we're seeing is a conflict resolution. So if you don't have basic understanding of conflict resolution and sort of a bit of a rule-making apparatus that people mutually agree on, then you will have more of a tendency for those communities to break down. So just to answer that question, that's one of the things that we see, and when you have a full understanding of that, then you can start developing more sophisticated governance models that may connect to the cloud, right? Where you use tools and technologies, and then those communities can actually grow and they can maintain decentralization, corruption resistance. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at right now. But yeah, once any of our this is not just Polis, once we get an adequate understanding of what is most optimal for creating collective betterment and human flourishing and also collective prosperity, then certainly a nation state could attempt to roll that out. But the problem is, like, a lot of these communities are either they're like microstates or they have a decentralized component or they're using certain kinds of technologies. That's going to be very difficult and almost unwieldy for a massive monocultural nation state to implement effectively because the environment and the context is completely different, right? So now there are probably pieces of that they can pick out and they can choose and they can try to implement. And probably the smaller the nation state, like if it's a micronation, then there's more of a chance for them to implement some framework or some model and have it work. But there's another thing that, we think of, anyone working in governance tends to think about the importance of the cultural context, right? So that's another thing that's not going to be easily transferable to different communities, is that you have to include thoughts about what do the local culture looks like. Because all these, even here, we come into Switzerland doing Switzerland, and there's a local community that has to be integrated into that, right? And granted, in Switzerland, they're more open because of the canton model. But imagine, going into a place like Nigeria or something crazy, right? Or somewhere in Africa. Now you have to integrate those indigenous communities into your network. You can't come in and not include those communities because then you look like a neo-colonialist, right? And that's what we want to try to prevent also. Yeah. So the point is that you can't just copy any given governance model and necessarily apply it to a nation state because there's context switching that has to be taken into account. Not to say that there's not individual elements or parameters they can adopt. That's very possible, but there's a lot of complexity involved too.
I totally agree, and I think culture is like a big piece. And we talk about like the nation state culture. We talk about company cultures. Like that's like what is built inherently within, and like people from outside might not like understand actually what is going on, but for people within that particular culture that's like super fluent, or like that's how we want to be governed, but like some other culture will be like that's not what we want, therefore like you cannot copy paste it. And like we are here in Switzerland, and they have direct democracy, which is kind of not very common in nation states in general. And so I'm from Czech Republic, which is nearby. Like it's a 6-hour drive from here. It's similar size country, but I don't think it will work there. And we are like geographically very close. Size-wise, we are very close. We are surrounded by mountains as well. Like there are so many similarities, but still like the history is different. Like basically where we are coming from is different. And like at like our country, like I feel like people just don't want to vote on things. They don't want to be asked for opinion on. They want to ask for opinion to complain, but not to actually vote. So like I totally agree with you that like we cannot copy paste like different governance structures. I also know that like you are working with one particular network state called Logos.
Oh, Logos, yep.
Maybe can you like describe a little bit like what's the like purpose of Logos? And maybe we mentioned a couple like Balaji network state, and we mentioned like, Liberland and stuff. Like what Logos is actually focusing on.
Yeah. So Logos is really interesting. I'm happy. I do just disclosure. I do the community building with Logos. Logos is specifically developing the technological stack to deploy institutions for network states, right? So, and actually build the cyber states of the future. The reason why this is really, really important.
Can you maybe like, what means like building institutions for network states?
Yeah. So this is very similar to your thoughts and what your community understands as a DAO, right? A decentralized autonomous organization, which is an organization built on a blockchain apparatus, right? So the idea is very similar. So an institution, a network state is very DAO-like, except the intention is also potentially, and this is potentially, to apply governance models to physical land as well. But it's definitely a cloud-first institutional structure. So you can build DAOs on top of, by the way, the platform is actually called Nomos. That's part of Logos. And it's in its infancy, but there's a lot of things to discuss here. But I'm just going to briefly mention Nomos is the blockchain that is part of the Logos tech stack that's still in a research and development phase. It's one of the youngest technologies. There's 2 other pieces of the tech stack. We'll get into the reasons for all this too. So Waku is one that's been around a while. It's a peer-to-peer communication protocol that has privacy-preserving characteristics, right? And then Codex. Codex is a decentralized data storage protocol, right? And the reason that we have all three of these protocols, right? And remember, this is public goods. This is infrastructure. Because currently the biggest problem, one of the problems with DAOs too, is that there's points of weakness, right? One of those is like on a Web3 app on the front end, everything is connected like Amazon and Google and shit. So those can actually be attacked. So to build actual network states, you want them to be extremely resilient because they're going to be under attack potentially from rogue actors, black hat actors, all kinds of entities. So you need actual decentralization. You don't need this idea of decentralization theater where everything is, we pretend it's more decentralized than it actually is. And so we believe we need this full stack to kind of retool the internet. So there's more decentralization. You have data more decentralized. You have comms more decentralized. And then you have a consensus layer that is also privacy preserving. Because that's another important part. You need to be as anonymous or as private as you need to be for the creation of these institutions. Could you imagine like creating a whole nation built around these technologies and then someone can just press a button, right? And your whole thing just shuts down, right? I hope that explains the vision of Logos. That's why I love working with the organization and beside them, because this is my vision for the future as well. And I don't think we really truly build quote unquote network states until we have this infrastructure properly rolled out, at least on the technological side of it, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, now, like basically with all the cloud-based solutions, like you might have some redundancy, so your data are not in one warehouse, but maybe two warehouses. But that's about the decentralized that is can get, so if someone just shut down the electricity to the warehouse, like a whole network state is basically down, the data are deleted and stuff like that. So the risk might be low because it's in their best interest, economical interest to like keep it running. However, there might be bigger economic interest at some point, and then you are just in very bad place. Well, you are the community leader for the logo, so maybe the last point here would be like how people can learn more about Logos and maybe join Logos.
Yeah,
so you can build bigger community.
Absolutely. So the best place to go and to immediately get a taste of Logos is to go to logos.co, and there's a manifesto written on logos.co, and you can get the full sweep of ideas, and then you can also check out the different platforms. And you can go to the Logos Twitter account. I don't know the exact, I think it's logos_network at logos_network.
We will put it in the show notes.
Yeah. So you go to the X account, and we regularly post. We also host spaces. You're kind enough to come on one actually on tomorrow. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. And we're going to be talking about the limitations of blockchain governance, which we touched a little bit on, right?
Today. We can continue tomorrow.
We'll continue that discussion for sure. But that's where you can logos.co, and then on the X feed, and through there you can get the the sort of the central repository to find all the other pieces of the organization and all the protocols.
And you can sign up for the newsletter there as well, probably.
Yeah. So the newsletter, you'll put it in the show notes. We have a farewell to Westphalia for the book that I mentioned earlier that Jared and Peter wrote, and you can sign up for that, and that'd be great. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming and like explaining our audience what network states are and like what governance we can improve.
Absolutely, my friend Puncar.
Appreciate it. Yeah.